Good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Burnett. I'm a member of the core group of the Scottish Laity Network, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to our first session of the Lenten Journey. Before handing over to Margaret McPhail, who will, on behalf of Eco Congregation Scotland, introduce our companion for tonight, I would like to say something about our theme. During the lockdown last year, the SLN undertook a journey of discernment, which was a time to pray and reflect on the signs of the times, a time to discern how we could become more authentic disciples of Jesus. And at the end of the 6-week journey, we gathered in assembly, and Father Augusto Zampini shared with us about the work of the Vatican COVID-19 Commission. He told us that Pope Francis had summed up the aim of the Commission in just 3 words: prepare the future. And Augusto stressed that this is radically different from prepare for the future, which implies our future is already set out and all we can do is react to it. Prepare the future focuses on our ability to become, in the words of Pope Paul VI, artisans of our own destiny. And putting the future into the context of the pandemic, Father Augusto shared this powerful cartoon. And it shows that this devastating preliminary round is forcing the world to reflect on our individual and collective values and the interconnectedness of all life on this planet. As disciples of Jesus, it has called us to return to the foundational dream and mission of Jesus, the proclaiming and ushering in of a new world, a world of justice, peace, sisterhood, and brotherhood. The dream and mission of Jesus is rooted in his prophetic imagination, and that is what we need to recapture. And its role is powerfully expressed by Walter Brueggemann.
The prophet engages in futuring fantasy. The prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing.
So let's now spend some time in silence, praying that we might be open to the Spirit stirring our imagination through Mother Earth, who cries out to us, and through our young people across the earth who also cry out to us. Let us pray that on our Lenten journey, the Spirit will nurture within us our prophetic imagination and empower us to strive to make our dream a reality. We now pray our traditional prayer to the Holy Spirit. Each verse will be read by a member of the core group, and the words will be on the screen for you to join in.
Come, Holy Spirit, breathe down upon our troubled world. Shake the tired foundations of our crumbling institutions. Break the rules that keep you out of all our sacred spaces. And from the dust and rubble, gather up the seedlings of a new creation.
Come, Holy Spirit, inflame once more the dying embers of our weariness. Shake us of our complacency, whisper our names once more, and scatter your gifts of grace with wild abandon. Break open the prisons of our inner being, and let your raging justice be our sign of liberty.
Come, Holy Spirit, and lead us to places we would rather not go. Expand the horizons of our limited imaginations. Awaken in our souls dangerous dreams for a new tomorrow, and rekindle in our hearts the fire of prophetic enthusiasm.
Come, Holy Spirit, whose justice outwits international conspiracy, whose light outshines spiritual bigotry, whose peace can overcome the destructive potential of warfare, whose promise invigorates our every effort to create a new heaven and a new earth, now and forever.
Amen.
Empowered by the Spirit, we continue the mission entrusted to us. Come, Holy Spirit, come. It's now my pleasure to welcome Margaret McPhail, who leads the Eco Group at St Ninian's and St Clement's in Dundee, and who has kindly agreed to introduce her companion for this evening. So over to you, Margaret.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Professor Jim Skea. I'm especially thrilled because Jim, like myself and some others in the group this evening, he's a Dundonian. However, more importantly for our meeting anyway tonight, he is internationally recognised as a leading climate scientist. He's the co-chair of Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC for short, and is leading their work on climate change mitigation. The IPCC is the world's highest authority on climate change science and advises governments on all scientific information related to climate change, its impacts and its mitigation, so that they can develop effective climate policy themselves. In addition to this international role, Jim was appointed chair of the Just Transition Commission in September 2018 by the Scottish Government. Now, I know I could say an awful lot more about Jim, but I think I'll just hand over to the man himself and let him get on with it. Over to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Margaret, and thanks for keeping it short, but I do very much appreciate that. Now, I've got a few slides that I'm going to show that you will take us through the talk. So let me just see if I can manage the technology, okay, and get that going. So I hope that everybody can sort of see one slide now, and I think people are nodding, so that's okay. Right, so this is what I'm going to talk about, the Hope for COP26. And just to say, when you're talking about climate change, sometimes the word hope is a very difficult one to work with because there's always a tendency for a lot of doom and gloom and despair about just the size of the challenge that's involved. So I hope what I'm going to try to do is actually illustrate that we do have this power, this ability that was talked about right at the beginning to deal with these problems. There are approaches that we can take. It's a tractable problem if we have the will to get on with it. And the other thing I'm going to say, because with COP26, the world is going to be coming to Glasgow, that's roughly the pattern I'm going to follow in the slides that come up. I'll talk about global warming as a global issue, then I'll narrow it down to Scotland to see what's happening here specifically, and then I'll end off by talking about COP26 and what the expectations might be. So with that in mind, here goes. And I'm going to start at a very basic, kind of level and talk about, why are we worried about the problem about global warming? And it has been known as the greenhouse effect. And basically what happens, you know, there's energy comes in from the sun to the earth. It's bounced off the earth's surface in the form of heat. Some of it escapes back into space, but some of the heat is trapped by gases in the atmosphere. And the general effect of that is to warm the earth up. And it's a jolly good thing there is a greenhouse effect, because if it wasn't for the greenhouse effect, the temperature on the surface of the earth would be extremely cold beyond. So this is what creates the conditions, you know, for human living. The problem is that human activities since the Industrial Revolution have added to these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They've made the greenhouse effect bigger, and as a result, the world has actually started to warm up. So that's basically that's why it's called the greenhouse gas effect. There are a few gases out there that make it basically it acts like a greenhouse and warms the interior, what's inside the glass up. Now, the other thing on human emissions tipping the balance, the most important greenhouse gas that causes this effect is carbon dioxide, which is emitted from, you know, when we burn coal, we burn oil, we burn gas, and also from some land things. But the key point is also that carbon dioxide is coming in and out of the atmosphere all of the time. You know, trees and plants breathe, and, you know, they give out and take in carbon dioxide. So some of these, you know, these changes are quite big. There are exchanges with vegetation, with trees, and with soils. But again, human emissions have just kind of shifted the balance a bit in terms of it, because we're emitting from factories. But things like land use and trees also make a big difference. Also to flag, there's a big exchange of carbon dioxide with the ocean as well. So when carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, it's taken in, it's exchanged with the oceans as well. It's part of that big cycle. But as I say, the effect is that human emissions have shifted the balance of that system overall, the one that existed before the Industrial Revolution. In a way, you can think of the atmosphere as being a bit like a bath, and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is like water in the bath. Before we started interfering with things, there were natural carbon dioxide emissions from land, and there were ways that land and the ocean took carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but they sort of balanced each other, and the level of carbon dioxide in the bath stayed still. But after the Industrial Revolution, we increased our emissions, and we increased it. So basically, the carbon dioxide is flowing into the bath quicker than we can get it out the waste pipe at the bottom. So carbon dioxide is building up in the atmosphere, and that is obviously adding to the greenhouse gas effect. Now, as well as actually, I'll go back to the previous one, is as well as putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, in principle, we can take some carbon dioxide out as well, which I'll be coming on to. So when you plant a tree, its growth means that it's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there are more kind of nature-based ways of dealing with carbon dioxide as well. But that kind of analogy, like carbon in the atmosphere being like water in a bath, is quite a good way of thinking about the way that we do it. And one other thing to flag is that carbon dioxide, once it's up in the atmosphere, it tends to stay there for a long time, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that means that once you've put the carbon dioxide up there, it stays there and the greenhouse gas effect continues. So everything extra amount of carbon dioxide, every gram, every kilogram that we put into the atmosphere is going to make a difference for quite a long period of time, which is one of the reasons why fairly urgent action is really being called for by a lot of people. Now, so what difference has that actually made? Well, scientists have been measuring the temperature of the surface of the Earth and the surface of the ocean as well, initially by just dipping buckets of water into the ocean and taking the temperature. That was how they did it. So we actually have quite a good record for what's happened to the world's temperature since around the middle of the 19th century. And there's a very clear picture that the temperatures have gone up, especially since about the middle of the 20th century here. And you can see that since the Industrial Revolution, This is comparing with, kind of 1919 to year 2000 kind of levels as zero. That since the Industrial Revolution, the world has already warmed up by 1 degree compared with the pre-industrial level. And though that doesn't sound very much, it can actually make a big difference because it's not the same in all parts of the world. Some parts of the world warm more than others. But at the moment, what the scientists are saying is that basically the world is absolutely definitely warming, and it's absolutely our activities that are causing it to happen. And there's no kind of doubt about that. And there's all kinds of lines of evidence that make it clear that that's what is happening. Now, why do we care about it? Now, the world has warmed by about 1 degree already. And basically, if we carry on as we are, we're headed to about 3 degrees warming by the end of this current century. And these are we can actually see the effects of climate change already. So top left-hand corner, warming is especially big in the Arctic region. So that's a picture of polar bears who were once hunting on the ice, foraging round a waste dump in northern Canada. And if the world warms by even 2 degrees, it's likely that we'll see a completely ice-free Arctic Ocean about once every 10 years. So this is a really, really big change. Top right-hand corner, and this is closer to home. It's not actually Scotland, it's Devon and Cornwall. But what happens when you combine sea level rise, which goes with climate change as the oceans warm up, with increased storm activity? Because if there is more heat in the atmosphere, there's more water and there's more storm activity. And combining sea level rise with storms increases the risks of flooding, which is something that we have already seen around in different parts of the world, including parts of the UK. Bottom left-hand corner is coral reefs, like off the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And already at 1 degree warming, we are seeing warm water corals in the tropical regions dying off. And at 2 degrees warming, we will basically see the end of tropical corals. And it's not just the heat. They're also being affected because as carbon dioxide goes into the ocean, it becomes like more mildly acidic, and the acidity of the ocean also has an effect. So we're seeing big effects there already. On bottom right-hand corner, this is more like, sub-Saharan Africa, where people are really on really quite marginal livelihoods, where we've seen drought increasing, which can be directly attributed to climate change as well. And these are all things that we can see happening even at 1 degrees warming, but we're on our way to much worse unless we get a grip of the situation and take some actions to curb our emissions. So that's why I think we're worried about it. I mean, it may well be that people like going to the beach better in Broughty Ferry or wherever if the world warms up a bit, but that's a very selfish and narrow point of view. We need to think about a much wider picture. So one of the things that happened, we all know about the Paris Agreement that took place in 2015, where the countries actually stated quite a high level of ambition. And what they said was that they would like to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, which is still a bit warmer than we are at the moment. And they kind of understood what would happen at 2 degrees warming, but they had no idea what would happen at 1.5 degrees. So they asked us in the IPCC to produce a report which talked about the impacts of global warming at different levels, and also what you would need to do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide emissions in order to keep warming down to that level. And that's the report we produced about 2.5 years ago in 2018. And probably the writing's quite small. There's a very long subtitle to that report. But at the end of the subtitle, you'll see it says, in the context of sustainable developments and efforts to eradicate poverty. And that is extremely important for many countries, particularly in the developing world, that as well as dealing with climate change, we think about other things like the Sustainable Development Goals about eliminating hunger, eradicating poverty, alongside the challenge of dealing with climate change. And this really drives a lot of our work there, trying to think about the whole picture overall. Now, this is a classic scientist picture of a graph of which we fill our IPCC reports. So keep it as simple as possible. It's a picture of possible pathways for carbon dioxide emissions during the 21st century. So the graph runs from 2010 to the year 2100. And global emissions of carbon dioxide are around about 40 billion tons a year at the moment from all sorts of different sources. And what the blue band of scenarios or different pathways for emissions shows you is what pathways you would have to follow to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And basically, to stop global warming, you have to, because carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, you have to get emissions to zero at some point if you're going to stop global warming. And what this is basically saying, the so-called net zero point is about the middle of the 21st century. It's about 2050 globally. Not every country needs to do it at the same time, but that's where you would need to be globally. And the range doesn't actually, in terms of timing, doesn't actually affect it so much, but there are quite a range of different pathways that could take you there. The other critical point to look is the sort of the shorter term, out over the next 10 years. What's going to happen then? And basically the message is that you would need to cut global carbon dioxide emissions by almost a half by then to put yourself on a pathway to keep the option open of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that is extremely ambitious. Let me just say, just given where we are at the moment. But I'm recalling the word hope is in my title, so let's keep that there. And just to say, one of the reasons, why it appears to be ambitious, this is another graph that's published and revised every year from the United Nations Environment Programme. And basically what they do is they compare the kind of long-term pathways that come out from us in IPCC. That's the 2 degrees, 1.5, 1.8, 1.5 degrees, where you would need to be in terms of emissions. And they compare it with this blue line here of where we would be and if all the countries in the world kept doing what they are at the moment. As part of the Paris Agreement, countries are starting to make a number of pledges, which we've got a dreadful number of acronyms in this world. NDC stands for Nationally Determined Contribution, which I will call a pledge from this point onwards because it keeps it a bit simpler. If the pledges were implemented, we would probably manage to keep emissions stable, but we're still a long way away from where we would need to be if we were going to get towards these pathways to limit warming to 1.5 or even 2 degrees. So we have a long way to go and we really need to step up the effort. And that is part of the agenda for COP26 actually, is making sure that that effort is stepped up. So a few slides with lots of words on them, for which I apologize. But just to say, one of the messages we picked out is that limiting warming to 1.5, it requires 3 very carefully chosen adjectives: rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all systems. You've got to do something that hasn't been done before. It needs all sorts of technologies and behavioral changes. We need to scale up the investment we make in low carbon energy like renewables and energy efficiency. We've got to get most of global electricity from renewable energy by the middle of the century. We've got to get out of coal for electricity generation anyway by the middle of the 21st century. And we will need some oil and gas for a bit longer because they might be needed for things like, people will continue to fly, and it's very, very, very difficult to think about getting a plane in the air with any other means but a liquid fuel. And you need oil for other things like heavy goods transport, where the electric route isn't quite so common. But it needs deep emission cuts just in all sorts of sectors: transport, buildings, lots of different things. But it's not just about energy. It involves changes in the way potentially we use land as well, and the way we design our cities, which is very important in the developing world. Now, I mentioned that it was possible to remove carbon dioxide, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as well as putting it in. And all of these pathways that I showed on that graph a couple of slides back involve some degree of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. And it's partly because that would compensate for difficult emissions, heavy industry, aviation, sectors where it's very difficult to get the carbon dioxide out would need to be compensated for by some carbon dioxide removal. But also it may be necessary to actually reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in the longer term. Now, there's lots and lots of different ways of doing that. And some we're doing already and we could do more of, and some of them are a bit more on the drawing board, if I could put it that way. So an obvious way is to stop cutting down trees. And existing forests actually grow. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So if you cut the trees down, you take that sink away. We can plant more trees, and that's a big part of the Scottish effort, for example, is increased tree planting to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We can take carbon out of the chimneys from industry and power stations and storage. And actually in Scotland, you can actually store some of the carbon dioxide out of the depleted oil and gas reserves out in the North Sea would be a way of doing it. We can grow bioenergy crops, burn the crops, and then capture the carbon. And that acts as a way of getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But nobody has done that commercially any part of the world. So that's an on the drawing board system. And then I think the thing that people are getting a lot more interested in is so-called nature-based solutions, which include how you manage farms, how you manage agriculture, how you manage livestock. For example, changing the diets for cattle can reduce emissions of methane, which is a greenhouse gas. You can manage farmland in ways that builds carbon up in the soils again. And that's something that we really need to incentivize. Scotland, you can restore peat bogs, and that's something that's really, really important. For example, in the Flow country in the north of Scotland, as if that were managed better, it would take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the worry for all this, if you do these approaches the wrong way, it's got implications for biodiversity, for nature of another kind. In a way, the cure could be worse than the disease if you're not careful about it for some of these measures. And at the global level, if we converted lots of land over to growing trees and bioenergy crops, it could take land away for food production and threaten food security, which is an important part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to balance these things very carefully, but carbon dioxide removal is absolutely part of the picture. And just to say, of course, there are all the things that we could think about, in our own lives, when we do things. It's not all about industry and the other things that other people are doing. And when you're asked by a journalist, what are the two biggest things that people do in their own life that would make a difference? It's what they eat and how they fly are probably the biggest impacts. Diets like we have in the Western world that are very, very heavy in terms of livestock, whether it's dairy or whether it's meat, carry a big carbon footprint. And so, introducing more vegetable elements into a diet would absolutely help. Now, just to flag, as scientists, we also produced a special report on climate change and land, and we were absolutely clear to say we're not telling people what to eat. That's not the job of the scientists. But we would point out that if you did have a different diet, it would not only be good for the planet, but it would prolong active life for you as well. So there are big sort of health and climate benefits from these areas. And flying is a very important area, but just want to flag a very small number of people account for a huge chunk of the world's aviation emissions. So a small number of people like me who fly to IPCC meetings in all parts of the world could actually make a big difference if we can do more of this stuff virtually. But closer to home, a very obvious way is improving the energy efficiency of our homes, which involves much more insulation, getting the energy use down, and perhaps moving away from using gas boilers over to electric heating systems, where if the electricity came from renewable energy, it would give us a very low carbon footprint for our homes at the same time. So that's a big step forward. And obviously the way we travel, I've put electric cars in as one example, and that would be a big thing that we could do. But let's not forget active travel as well. More walking and cycling and replacing other trips are all things we could do. So there's a big hope part of it. There are all lots of things we can do as individuals to sort of move the agenda onwards. Also, if we embrace some of the new technologies as well, it's a mixture of kind of the behavioral and the technical that will take us on. Now, some people come and tell us, well, why can't we fix it all by planting more trees? Okay, well, this is a slide I took from UNESCO, the UN educational and science thing. We have to remember that the land on which we might plant trees belongs to somebody, and they're already using it for a different purpose at the moment, for their livelihoods may depend on that land. So we need to be very cautious about the idea that you can cover the world with trees, given the existing livelihoods that are dependent on it. And the example I guess I would use in Scotland, we don't want to replace the highland clearances of the 19th century with the carbon clearances of the 21st century and taking away people's livelihoods. So we need, when we are planting trees, doing afforestation, we need to do it very carefully and with regard to the kind of land tenure and who gets their livelihoods from that land. So we can't point to people in other parts of the world and say we can fix it with trees. The responsibility is ours to do something with the previous kinds of measures. Now, if I can switch gear for a moment and just talk about, what's happening about climate change in Scotland. And actually, this is actually a slide I tend to use when I'm boasting about Scotland to people outside Scotland. So forgive me for that bit of it. But the top right is obviously the Parliament. And, Scotland has devolved powers. We've got our own Climate Change Act, which now includes a net zero target, which I was talking about earlier. And Scotland wants to do net zero by 2045, including our contribution to international flying and shipping. So Scotland, in a way, is ahead, even of the numbers that I put there in that slide for globally. On the bottom right-hand corner is the advantage Scotland has, and this is where I start boasting again to people on the outside, is we have a government that actually cares about it. We ran an IPCC meeting in Edinburgh about 2 years ago, and the First Minister did actually turn up to it, turned up to the reception, gave us an address and met all us scientists before hopping off down to London on a plane to negotiate Brexit issues. So we were very impressed that she took the time out to come and do it. And you just do get the impression this is a government that cares about and is determined to do something. So we have a climate change plan on to how that target for 2045 we could be met. We have the aspirations for a so-called just transition, which is very much about the social issues, which I'll come on to. And there's a big effort going on at the moment on public engagement and trying to speak to people to get a better sense of how people can get engaged with the climate agenda. So the climate change plan, it was revised in December when it came out, but it's got a host of different targets and measures that cover transport, what's going to happen in housing, planting trees, etc. So there's a lot of specific items in there, but many of them can't be achieved unless you get people engaged in this, get companies engaged, ordinary citizens engaged, farmers engaged with it, and get behind the climate change agenda. And one of the things I'm very impressed with, the Climate Change Act that was revised just over a year ago, made provision to have a climate assembly that brought lots of people together, ordinary people, to talk about the climate agenda and what they thought the priorities for an ambitious climate policy would be. So since before Christmas, a climate assembly has been going together, which involves, I think, up to about 100 citizens who volunteered to participate in this process. And they're giving up 5 weekends altogether to get together to talk about different aspects of the climate change agenda and produce a set of recommendations that will go to the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government. And I've been lucky enough to be invited to participate in 3 of their sessions. The next one is on Saturday at 11 o'clock. That's in my diary. Basically, because they're asking for advice from people that they think are experts. But just to emphasize, the outputs of this are going to be the outputs of what ordinary people recommend. And obviously, it started off with the intention of being a physical assembly, but the picture at the top right-hand corner shows that it's very much been yet another Zoom fest in terms of taking things place. But honestly, the people are so enthusiastic, they asked for an extra weekend to be put onto it. So they have got a lot of enthusiasm, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the ideas they've come up with on Saturday. The one that was mentioned at the beginning, we've got the idea of a just transition for Scotland, and just means justice. It's about being fair to people and being equitable, because undoubtedly a net zero society and economy is going to look a bit different from the one that we've got at the moment. And we must make sure that people aren't unfairly burdened by the change when it takes place. There are some kinds of jobs that will disappear in a net zero economy, but there are others that will emerge. Everything will change, but we need to manage that change in a way that's fair to people. And I think this kind of catches it. A just transition is making that the benefits of climate change are shared widely, and the costs don't fall in an unreasonable way on those who are least able to pay. And so this is very much what the Just Transition Commission that I'm now chairing is about. And so just to say what we've done, we started at the beginning of 2019. So our first year, we could have physical meetings. Second year, we're back to Zoom again, I'm afraid. But one of the things that we've done very carefully is to go around different parts of Scotland to talk to people about the different aspects. So top left-hand corner, our first meeting, we actually went to the Coalfields Regeneration Trust in Kincardine to talk with people about how the exit from coal in Scotland had been managed, to learn any lessons from it. That was particularly helpful because it was very close to the Lungannock power station, the last coal-fired power station that closed in 2016. We didn't make a special trip to visit the Kelpies on the top right-hand corner. We were actually visiting the Grangemouth refinery, but that's a much nicer picture than all the kind of pipe work. So we were talking to people at INEOS, the company there, and also the local community around Grangemouth and Falkirk about their engagement with the plant. Bottom left-hand corner, we were talking with farmers down in Melrose about their challenges with land management, and we get lots of very interesting issues that farmers are raising that many of us townies had just not appreciated. It was really very good to learn about what happens for multi-generation leases and succession rules and how that interacted with inheritance laws, so which was something that never occurred to me, but it actually applies and affects the climate change agenda and issues like tree planting. And in the bottom in the middle, we went to Aberdeen to talk to younger people employed in the oil and gas industry to talk about their perceptions of where things could go, because obviously that's an industry that has to change. And just in the bottom right-hand corner, that's us in yet another windowless room, and I can't even remember where it was, but we did try to get around the country a bit. So just a few principles. I mean, just transition has emerged as a way for most countries about thinking about how you manage the rundown of the coal industry. Scotland is out of coal, so we need to think about a new set of issues. It has a wider application. So we're thinking about the oil and gas industry that's obviously there, but we're also thinking about the consumption side and communities and particular places and how they're affected by the climate agenda. And it's not just about future injustices. There are lots of existing injustices that relate to things like land tenure, fair work, and energy poverty, that actually the net zero agenda gives us a chance to address them. So on fair work, if somebody, was made redundant following the Lungannock closure, it's a question about whether what do they do next? And we hope it's not delivering pizzas or perhaps working at the Amazon distribution center, which is potentially not the best quality work available. So we need to think about that quite carefully. And in our interim report from about a year ago, we talked about the need for very clear planning, engaging with people, and so that we go with the grain of where society expects to go, and building equity considerations into all climate policies right from the beginning. Now, the other thing, of course, that happened in the middle of our work, we came across the COVID hit us. right in the middle of our activities. And it very much affected what people were doing about the climate change agenda as well. And in fact, Rosanna Cunningham, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform, did ask us to produce a very quick report on how you reconcile this issue of doing things fairly, climate change and the response to the COVID crisis. And what we released that report in July, it's all available online. And we were very much flagging up the issue that young people were especially at risk. People who were on the edge of entering the labour market could be particularly affected. We were very concerned about issues around changing patterns in transport use, and particularly if you were going to address climate change, then public transport could play a much bigger role. But there's obviously with COVID, there's a fairly strong aversion to using public transport that we need to think about carefully. We've got a big rapid transition in the oil and gas sector because the oil price collapsed. It had a big effect on activities in Aberdeen. So how does that fit in? And aspects of the rural economy, especially in the hospitality sector, have been hit especially hard. But we did also, I'll just say it's not on the next slide, so I'll mention it, that one of our recommendations was actually there were lots of jobs to be created around tree planting and peatland restoration that could provide new activity in the rural sector. So this is what we recommended. We recommended a big amount of investment in improving the energy efficiency of buildings. It's a no-brainer investing in buildings. You have to do it as part of the climate change agenda. It can address energy poverty, and it can also help to create jobs for the people who are in there retrofitting houses. A very obvious area. We were very strong on supporting Scotland's bus manufacturing activity. We've got Alexander Dennis, which is a world-class company producing electric buses, hybrid buses that could really make a big effect. And we actually made a deliberately provocative recommendation to procure a fleet of clean buses for COP26 to ferry all the delegates around, which is something that we could kind of boast to the rest of the world about. And we were very interested in what we do about the oil and gas sector. And we actually think there are quite a lot of skills in the oil and gas sector that we should be moving into the zero carbon economy as well. So for example, oil and gas could be used, carbon capture and storage as something where you need the skills in the oil and gas sector. If we're moving towards the development of hydrogen as a fuel, which would be part of it, there are jobs there for people who are skilled in that sector. But the jobs may not come along as quickly as the old jobs disappear. So we also made a big, strong bid for commissioning, speeding up the decommissioning of our infrastructure in the North Sea to help us along. So these are all the kind of recommendations that we recommended. Now, I'm going to be running out of time. So this is my very last slide, and this is about the hope for COP26. And it's worthwhile also I think it's worthwhile describing, I'm not sure if anybody else on has been to a conference of the parties. I've been to the last 4 or 5, and so I kind of know what it's about. And just in terms of the physical presence, it's usually in some big conference center. And the nearest analogy I can get to the physical feeling of being there is like being in something like the Silverburn shopping center on a Saturday afternoon with lots of people milling around for various purposes. It's a very confusing event. And even if you go there, you can actually lose track of what is actually going on. So it's part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's an annual event to push the negotiations forward. And every conference of the parties is hosted by a national presidency, which is the UK for COP26, collaborating with Italy. And the UK government has decided to put it in Glasgow. And so the world will be coming to Scotland. And this is not a small event for a few hundred people. There are 2 zones usually for a conference of the parties. There's a so-called blue zone, which you need accreditation and a sort of a card hung over your shoulder to get into. And at the last event in Madrid, there were 27,000 people accredited to get into the Blue Zone meeting. About half of them were delegates, about half of them were observers for things like NGOs, business groups, and about 3,000 of them came from the media. So you can imagine that even that Blue Zone, which is full of different complicated interacting meetings, is where a lot of the negotiating action takes place. But usually there's also a green zone, which anybody can get into, you can walk into, which is much more fun, which is where all the NGOs and other groups go to have their kind of side events. And I've done the pictures on the right-hand side to give you a feeling for the kind of things that might go on. So the top right-hand corner is a kind of side negotiating session. And typically that's the kind of thing you would get, I don't know, 100 and 150 people round a table talking about the issues, negotiating something forwards. On the bottom right bit is from all the environmental NGOs that get into the Blue Zone, who stir the things up by having demonstrations and side events to get things excited and keep the delegates on their toes. And the atmosphere between these two different kinds of meeting is just very, very different. So the objective of COP26 is to progress the climate change negotiations. And one thing to say, it's not something that people just turn up on the first Monday and get on with. There is a year or more's worth of preparation for each conference of the party. So there's an awful lot of things happening already at the moment in terms of getting things ready for it, so that with a bit of luck, when the politicians come up on the final days, that they have something to sign up on. And there are two big things that need to be done at the Conference of the Parties, as well as inspiring people. And we hope a lot of the activities in the green zone actually do that. But the first one is the Paris Agreement needs to be implemented according to the rule book, and governments haven't finished writing the rule book yet, and they've got very bogged down in discussions about it. And that's a big objective for the UK government, which is running it, to get that Paris rule book finished off. Otherwise, people can't be, if there's no rule book, people won't be able to collaborate internationally about many of these measures, particularly in relation to land use. And the other thing is that the national pledges that I mentioned, there's supposed to be a mechanism by which the people add up all the pledges, see whether they add up to the Paris ambition. And when they don't, people are supposed to come back with more ambitious pledges until you actually home in on the targets under Paris. So upping the ambition in terms of national pledges is really important. And it's not just a case of making declarations about reducing their emissions. Developed countries have to make commitments about finance. And for many developing countries, especially, say, sub-Saharan Africa, the finance for adapting to climate change is a critical part of the picture. So developed countries need to come up with their checkbooks as well as actually coming with commitments for emissions. And there are also commitments in building in resilience to the climate change we know we're going to have to live with. So that's where they are. I would say COP26 is not going to be as big a landmark as the Paris Agreement back in 2015. Which was an absolute, but it is a very, very important milestone. And I hope, as well as all the tedious negotiations that I've got in the top right-hand corner, the activities can actually act as a bit of an inspiration to other people there as well. So in the hope that it can all be run physically, I do hope that people, different communities, religious communities, civil society groups can get involved in COP26, because it is a very important event. And I really do hope that we can clarify some of the confusion about it, because believe me, a COP is a very complicated business to get in. You can be in the middle of it and not understand what's going on. So best of luck to me and best of luck to you in taking it forward. And I'll finish off the presentation here.
I think Margaret's going to ask the first question before then we start to use the chat function.
Right, Jim, that was amazing. An awful lot to think about there. But I'm thinking from the youth just now, because being realistic, I'm not going to be around for years and years to come. but the next generation, my grandchildren, are. Do you think COP26 will actually address the demands of young people? For example, young people who are part of the Fridays for the Future movement, or the Scottish youth leaders who are involved in the Scotland-Malawi Partnership for Climate Change? And if not, what would you say to them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to say, you know, one thing. I mean, COP26 is not going to I do not expect a revolutionary outcome from COP26 in terms of level of ambition. To be realistic about it, but it can move the agenda forward, and I think that's really important. So in that sense, I hope it can give some hope to people. One thing, just to play from the scientific side, I know there's a lot of calls from groups like Extinction Rebellion. We need to get to net zero by 2025 or do it by 2030. And I'm afraid I really have to be realistic about that. We are not going to be able to do that, because we'd have to be able to do it, you know, with the existing cars, the existing houses, your existing fridges, and just turning that round in 5 to 10 years is such an ambitious ask. I don't think it's realistic. So it's very, very important that, you know, like the whole kind of agenda for COP6, it's about adaptation to climate change that we will inevitably have. It is about mitigation, and it is about, you know, standing up and accepting our financial responsibilities in the developed world as well, is all a part of the picture. So I am hopeful about it. And just to say to people, you know, if we get to warming of 1.6 degrees instead of 1.5 degrees, we don't fall over a cliff. It doesn't fall over. So we should absolutely not despair, even if things get beyond 1.5, because every little bit of extra effort will make a difference. Even if we get beyond 1.5 to 1.6, it's still better than going to 1.7, which will inevitably happen if we don't get a grip of ourselves and take some action. So there's a bit of a qualified hope. I'm sorry about the qualification, Margaret, but you know, I think over-promising and under-delivering is a sure way to get into the wrong place.
I know. Thank you.
Jim, your talk tonight has certainly generated a great deal of discussion in our chat area. And if I can start straight away with Helen's question, who, you know, we're talking here about the fact that politicians often only see as far as the next election. She asks, how can politics think and act for the longer term and be courageous enough to introduce long-term effective policies? What will it take, Jim?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one thing. The UK and Scotland actually do quite well on this, because the Climate Change Acts in both Scotland and the UK were intended to address the fact that politicians tend to look after the next 5 years and the next election, and actually putting in a long-term target for 2045 or 2050, and then having stepped approaches, you know, targets for the whole of the 2020s for Scotland out to the middle of the 2030s. Which, you know, the Scottish government has to come up with a way of doing something about, is a very, very good discipline. And there's been a huge amount of interest in other countries and other parts of the world about the way that UK and Scotland have done things, in terms of basically trying to discipline Scotland to think about politicians to think about the long term, which is the big challenge. And there are some areas where they can't do it. I mean, when you think about pensions, that's another area where you have to think about the long term. And governments, in a sense, have started to step up to it. And climate change is that ultimate, multi-generational problem that we need to deal with, which is the issue that Margaret was talking about in the first question. And I think the other hopeful sign, of course, is the US election. The US is back inside the Paris Agreement. That means that China and the US and the European Union are all on the right side, the biggest three emitting blocs. And that really makes an awful lot of difference. And before anybody asks, why do we do anything because the Chinese aren't doing it? The Chinese are doing an enormous amount. They've got a net zero target for 2060, in there. They've put it in place, and they are making significant changes. They've got the biggest investments in wind and solar energy in the world. So the Chinese are up for it as well. So three biggest emitters are now behind it. We just need to ensure that their ambition is appropriate.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jim. Our next question, perhaps a brief comment on HS2 in England and the fact that it's being described as the biggest deforestation in Europe. Should it be halted?
Right, this is where I put my IPCC hat on and say it's our policy not to comment on individual projects in individual countries, lest we get into a big deep bunch of trouble. I mean, I have to say, one of the things about I have my own reservations about HS2 because basically it's only going to knock 15-20 minutes off the journey to Birmingham, which in the way that people appraise transport projects, because they basically appraise the financial worth of a businessman's time, and it looks good on that basis. I have to say, I might be a little skeptical about reinforcing existing rail links, and doing with the kind of infrastructure you've got might be an appropriate way of doing things. But it's worthwhile saying that high-speed rail in general has really shifted people off short-term air travel. Now, that won't do the trick from London to Birmingham, but for other things, it has make a difference. So the climate convention takes place in Bonn. I live in London and I take the train to Bonn. I don't fly, and that was never possible without high-speed rail to actually do that. I jump on a train to Brussels, get there in 2 hours, change platforms, and an hour and a half later, I'm in Cologne and very close to Bonn. This is such a civilized way of doing things. So I'm supportive of high-speed rail in general, but whether a relatively short high-speed rail from London to Birmingham works, I think, is another question.
We have a number of questions related to travel, and perhaps I can try and take 2 or 3 of them together. The first is this notion of, has the pandemic and the travel restrictions impacted on global warming? And then others asked about your keenness to go back to physical meetings in some sense, COP26. Have virtual meetings not been the way forward?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question to ask on this side, because sure, it is, the pandemic has changed the pattern of emissions last year, but it only reduced global emissions by between 5 and 7%. Which is the best estimate. And remembering that carbon dioxide emissions accumulate in the atmosphere, that just means we're accumulating 5 to 7% less than we otherwise would have done. So actually, the effects on the global climate of COVID are practically undiscernible. They're so small because of that cumulative effect. But the question is going to be whether the kind of changes of pattern that we've had over the last 12 months are going to embed and actually stick there. And we have had the experience, because we were about to arrange a meeting in Ecuador with about a month to go when lockdown took place. And we switched at short notice to a virtual meeting for 250 scientists located all over the globe. But some of these meetings are really difficult to run virtually. We actually had an IPCC plenary session with all the governments just before Christmas, where they managed to get through one item in 3 days. From doing it virtually. It is really quite difficult to do, especially when you've got hard-on negotiations. So one of the things that you might think about is whether or not, when you run something like COP26, you actually restrict it just to the people who need to be there for the negotiations, and you do all the other stuff virtually, which done. Because we've actually found that some of the outreach meetings we run they're more effective virtually than they are physically, because you can get a wider range of people into them. So I do think we need to look at it differently, but I don't think it will altogether get rid of the need for physical meetings for some of the more difficult stuff where people need to look at each other eyeball to eyeball and get stuck into it.
Again, really useful, thank you. Noting what you said earlier about specific instances, I'm going to slightly reword this one around the proposed coal mine in Cumbria and ask maybe, more generically on new coal developments. Do you think that presents a danger in terms of what it says about the relationship of the industry to climate change?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very clear that the coal industry, has to run down quite radically. if you're going to deal with climate change. And actually, that's already being built into people's expectations. When the Peabody Coal Company in the US, looks for Chapter 11 protection, because basically it's not making any money there because the price of coal has gone down because of expectations about climate change. That's the direction that you're moving in. But I'm happy to say, I do think the Cumbria coal mine, for coming from the government that's hosting COP26, did not send a helpful signal. If I can put it that way. I think some of our bigger challenges are around what we do with the oil and gas industry at this stage, which is a much more important part still of the UK and the Scottish economy.
Our next question refers to I think one of your comments on transport and the hope of kind of electric cars and such like, which so often seems a controversial area in the press. Have you anything to say about the reported high environmental costs of generating electricity for cars and the mining for the essential lithium, and also the environmental costs of using the internet, as an aside?
Yeah. Just on electric vehicles, if you were going to get your electricity from coal-fired power stations or even gas-fired power stations, it wouldn't make a difference because you'd indirectly be putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But if you can get the electricity generated from renewables, and I noticed somebody else has mentioned nuclear power on the chat, which you maybe want to throw at me as well, then life cycle analysis, you're definitely in a better way with moving to electric vehicles. The other thing about reliance on rare metals and issues like the environmental impacts of lithium. One of the things that people have been worried about is that there tends to be a very small number of mines that the Chinese have bought up in Africa somewhere, so that there is a kind of risk there. But it's a very funny industry where the demand for a lot of these rarer metals has been so small that it's only economical for one mine somewhere in the world to supply it. If we want to expand the industry, there would be lots of other mines that could open and you could get multiple sources of supply. So it's not really entirely a security issue. And the other thing that people will be looking at is the question of recycling batteries as well. The electric vehicles have been completely new. When you get a new sector, people tend to dive in without thinking about all the consequences. But actually, we could be and we are doing much more research into issues about how you can recycle these metals and turn them around and use them again, which would reduce the environmental footprint in quite an important way.
Thanks, Jim. And just before I move on, I'll just remind everyone, please do continue to post in the chat. We're getting through the questions reasonably quickly, so I'm confident we'll have time to take quite a few. So please do continue to put them in. And perhaps, Jim, we could go exactly where you said and look at this issue of nuclear power. We've had a number of questions in the chat around this. And, Hugh Foy notes, George Monbiot has changed, quote unquote, his view on nuclear power. And this controversial issue. We've got others who are talking about, speaking to young people who've studied environmental science who believe that nuclear is the way forward. Others talking about the problems with decommission. Quite simply, Jim, what's your view on nuclear power?
Yeah, that's fine. Again, I'll put on my IPCC hat on because this is a dreadfully difficult topic in which we can get, when we are finalising our reports, we can get stuck on hours on debates about how to refer or not to refer to nuclear power. And just to say, it's happening very differently in different parts of the world. Nuclear power output has actually stayed stable globally for about the last 20 or 30 years. But it disguises two alternative trends, because nuclear power has been going down in Europe and North America as older plants have closed, and it's been going up, especially in East Asia, over a longer period around Japan, China, and Korea, especially investing in nuclear power where it's gone up. But there are also changes going on there. Japan has completely turned off nuclear power. The plants that were shut after Fukushima cannot be opened because it can only be done with the permission of the mayors of the local prefectures, who will not allow the plants to open up. So we are seeing changes in opinion, even in East Asia, actually, about the role of nuclear power, apart from in China. And just to bring it a bit closer to home, I've always thought nuclear power was about the economics and not much about the the more philosophical aspects. I mean, the Hinkley Point power station is costing about 99 pence per kilowatt hour to generate its electricity. Some of the offshore wind that's coming on is coming on at around 4 pence per kilowatt hour. And that just tells me that's kind of what the answer is. You know, investment in renewable energy has built up experience and brought the costs down. And renewable energy is cheaper than nuclear power. Renewable energy is actually probably cheaper than fossil fuels like gas-fired generation to generate electricity. There has been a genuine revolution in the renewables world, which has shifted costs and shifted deployment. And the nuclear industry, you know, has to measure up and has to demonstrate that it can demonstrate. And I would not be against it on principled grounds, but it's got to demonstrate that it can wash its face and, you know, supply power at a reasonable cost, so that all our people who are in energy poverty are not paying over the odds for their electricity.
Can you talk perhaps to the impact that Greta Thunberg has had on some of these discussions?
Yeah. I mean, she's obviously had a kind of huge impact, and you know, I think the climate change debate has changed profoundly over the last 5 years, and I would attribute it to three things. And let's see if I can remember what the three things are. One is the evidence that we've produced in IPCC, which has made a big difference. The second has been the big revolution in renewable energy. And the other has been civil society and the Greta effect. And these three things together, you know, I think have made a huge difference to the way the climate debate is taking place. And you can't attribute it all to one particular element of it. But, you know, the Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion have played their role in changing expectations about what we do about climate. And, you know, I think the world has changed a lot, and you can see it in the attitudes of, say, of the oil industry at the moment, which has completely woken up to the fact that it needs to renegotiate its kind of license to operate with civil society. They're all thinking about, switching over at least part of their activities to renewable energy, and all trying to tell us very good stories about where things are going. So, yeah, you know, Statoil, the Norwegian state oil company, has changed its name to Equinor. So we forget that it's actually an oil company, and it's now investing in renewables offshore.
Perhaps I can come to Kate's question next, and she asks, does it frustrate you that there is so much focus on the demonization of plastic when it's an essential part of the climate change solution?
Blah blah blah. I've never. I'm not sure. I think it. You know, this is not my area of expertise, I should say, but I think it is actually. Quite troubling, the fact that, you know, the amount of plastic that finds its way into the oceans. And that doesn't mean that we stop using plastic for all the uses, but we should certainly stop discarding it and throwing away in the way that we do. And we should be thinking about paper bags rather than plastic bags, and thinking, do we need all that wrapping in the goods? And I have to say, now that we're getting our home deliveries from supermarkets, the amount of packaging that's coming in with these home deliveries is truly terrifying me. You know, I think the amount of output that's happening from our house is not good at all. So there's nothing wrong with plastic per se, but we should treat it with a bit of respect and not throw away so much about it and use it more effectively.
Fantastic. And if I can come to Marie's question. So in our opening sequence tonight, Rab reminded us that Pope Francis has asked the world to prepare the future. And so our question is, if we're doing this, can we consider reducing the physical presence? And I know that we were talking about this earlier. If we come back to that point around travel, specifically looking at travel to COP26, do you think there would be options to reduce physical presence at that? Or would you specifically include that in the meetings you think need to happen?
Yeah. Well, as I said in answer to the earlier question, in principle, you could run a conference of the parties in a different way, where you brought a few hundred negotiators together rather than 27,000 people all in one place. You could pick the people who need to be there, because I do think you need a physical presence to do some part of it. But lots of the other events, in principle, you could just run virtually. Now, it has to be said that people, of course, actually quite like the theatre of the physical events, and the theatre can actually make a bit of a difference as well. So I think this does need to be thought about carefully. But perhaps you could think, for example, if some of the physical events did not take place all in the same part of the world, but you did something in Latin America and somebody took the bus from Peru to Ecuador to go to a physical event rather than flying all the way to Glasgow, or you do something in parts of India or other parts of Asia, or some of the African centers like Addis Ababa or Nairobi, for example, where there are big centers of activity. There are other ways of doing it, and we've actually thought a bit about in our meetings, could we do this in a regionally distributed way? So you have people meeting in different continents rather than flying people intercontinentally, which is where a lot of the carbon footprint comes from. We need to be more creative about it, and we could be.
Do you want to expand on that a bit, Jim? What do you think what would it look like if we were more creative?
Well, I think that's the idea, that not everybody needs to travel to the same single location down the globe. You could actually keep the sense of theatre by having some people meeting together in Lima or Rio de Janeiro and being virtually connected to say, like the main meeting taking place in Glasgow, rather than bringing everybody to a single part of the world. And it might be that some of these things are pressed on COP26 by necessity as well, because it's not quite entirely clear where the COVID situation will be. And just to flag that one thing that we come up with a lot of when we are trying to organize our physical meetings is the question of visas for people coming into developing countries. The UK is not the easiest country to get into, even to come to a scientific meeting. And you'll find that people in one part of the world need to physically travel to a consulate in another city to actually pick up their visa. And that is being affected by the COVID situation. Never being trying to get to the UK, traveling to get a visa, it can be an insurmountable problem in some parts of the developing world. So we could be in quite, there are really challenging issues to think about how you run this. Don't get me going on about visas. They're the bane of my life in organizing international meetings.
Interesting, thanks, Jim. If I can take Anne Dobbing's question and read it just now for you. She says, in the 1980s, heavy industry and shipbuilding industries and mining were obliterated by government policies, leaving communities of people devastated, especially in the northeast of England. How can we make sure that similar effects are not seen in Scotland, for example, when the North Sea oil industry is phased out? I'm thinking of communities, especially in the northeast of Scotland and the Northern Isles.
Yeah, as we're preparing the Just Commission final report, which is going to come out about the end of March, we are actually going to probably feature some elements that talk about what an unjust transition looks like. And what the person asking the question has just done that. That was an unjust transition. It wasn't planned. People's views weren't taken into account. It took place very quickly. And so some of the recommendations that will come out of our Just Transition Commission work would very much feed into that, and thinking about the oil and gas industry and what happens in the northeast and the Aberdeen area to compensate for it. And I flagged it. We did it a bit in our COVID report because the COVID has accelerated the decline of the North Sea oil and gas industry undoubtedly. So some of the issues are going to need to be dealt with anyway. So issues like getting on with decommissioning the North Sea will provide lots of work, plugging the wells that are out there that are not going to be used for production, thinking about whether the North Sea infrastructure can be used to develop the offshore renewables industry, thinking about whether some of the existing oil and gas wells can be used to store carbon dioxide that's been captured. And all these will provide work for people in the industry. But it is a bit of a challenge because getting the timing of the jobs right is quite a critical issue, because some of the jobs may take quite a few years to emerge, which is why this decommissioning is a big part of it. It's worthwhile saying, we are engaging with oil and gas workers, and there are aspects of the oil and gas industry that workers do not like, because the oil and gas industry is very volatile. Prices go up and down. And when prices go down, people get laid off. And when prices go up, people get taken back on again. And frankly, a lot of people don't like that aspect of their careers, this on and off situation. And it may well be if they're employed in more, some of the the net zero kind of projects, or the projects that will take you there, might be more stable and could provide more stable employment if it's planned in the right kind of way, compared with a very volatile global industry like oil and gas.
That's very interesting, and it's certainly something that I resonate with, you know, as I look out the window at the glow of Grangemouth Ineos just along the road from where I am at the moment. It's certainly a discussion that's raised here all too often is, you know, we're speaking about the largest employer in our community. And I think that that's often an argument that's used against any proactive action. I wonder if you might talk to that as well.
I mean, I showed that picture of us standing by the kelpies, and of course, I'd emphasise that the reason that we were in that part of the world was to talk about the Grangemouth complex, which is the biggest industrial site, it's really the only huge site left in Scotland for industry. So what happens to it is quite important. But there are big issues around, you know, for example, using hydrogen for some kinds of transport, and that's an area in which, you know, repurposing some of the facilities around Grangemouth would be a fairly obvious way of doing things. So the Grangemouth, I mean, it's got a lot of infrastructure. There's a lot of pipeline going in there. So if you were, you know, storing carbon in the North Sea, some of the pipelines that currently end at Grangemouth but might start at Grangemouth might also have a role to play. While we're on Grangemouth, I'll just flag up, because we did have meetings with actually local high schools and community people around Falkirk to talk about the issue. And worthwhile saying that there's a lot of communities that are immediately adjacent to the Grangemouth plant that don't get much economic benefit from it. We've talked about the issue of what you call DIDOs, drive-in, drive-outs. People, I mean, jobs are quite well paid in Grangemouth, and if you're paid with that, you can get a nice place to live some distance away from the plant in a more rural environment, drive in the morning or drive out again when your shift is finished. And a lot of that is not really touching the local community that's right adjacent to the plant, which actually has a lot of social problems involved with it. So we need to think about very carefully about these issues of place, and just not make the assumption because a plant is sitting there that the people who are living 10 minutes drive away are actually getting an economic benefit in it from. They may not. That's why the coal industry is actually different from the oil and gas industry, because in the coal industry, people tended to live right next to the mines. That's the way they were built up. Oil and gas industry, you get people flying in for their 3 weeks out in the North Sea from different parts of Europe, even from different parts of the world, and disappearing again, you know, once their sort of shift is done. So you've got to be very conscious of the dynamics in industry and the degree to which the jobs are actually sticking in Scotland and the local communities.
That's, again, really interesting. Thank you. And we've maybe got time for one or two more questions, so please continue to pop them in the chat there. And if I can take Rab's question, who's asking, as we look to the May elections, can you, Jim, think of 3 questions that we should be asking of those who are seeking our votes?
Well, I mean, basically the 3 questions are to ask them 3 times about the just transition and whether they're thinking about the equitable aspects of, you know, of making that change, you know, for the new parliament, and making sure that it sticks as we get a new parliament and you're actually thinking about the next direction. So 3 questions was very bold. So just 1 question, ask in a very loud voice, and ask it about doing it in a fair kind of way. I do know that the current Cabinet Secretary, Rosanna Kinningham, is quite committed to it, but she's retiring from politics. You know, she's not standing for the next election again. So making sure that the next generation of politicians have picked it up, I think, is going to be quite important.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. It's been really interesting chatting to you, and I'm going to pass over to Stephen Curran.
Thank you very much, Callum. Thank you to the Scottish Laity Network, and thank you to everyone taking part tonight, and Professor Jim Skea for an excellent opening to the Lenten Journey series. Special thanks to Margaret McPhail for a welcome and opening question, plus all the great environmental activities at St Ninians and St Columba's in Dundee. Tonight's presentation by Jim was hugely informative and insightful, and the discussion was wide-ranging but challenging, but also inspiring, and we all wish Jim well in all your continuing work, Jim, at such a vital time. Jim pointed out that we're facing a time of rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented change. Pope Francis calls us to prepare the future and hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Eco Congregation Scotland, as an ecumenical charity working with churches all over Scotland, thanks everybody here tonight for your participation on the first steps of this year's Lenten Journey. We're committed to support you and churches all across the country in our journey towards COP26, but also our journey beyond COP for the just transition we all need to shape here and around the world. So thank you again, Jim. Thank you to the Scottish Laity Network, and we look forward to joining you in the rest of your Lenten journey. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. Could I also add my personal thanks to Jim, to Margaret, to Stephen for his vote there, and also again to Callum, whom we rely on so much. We'd just now like to move into a closing prayer, followed by some adverts. So, loving God, we thank you for the gift and witness of Jim. We thank you for what he has shared with us tonight. We ask that you anoint him anew with your Spirit, such that your life may be deepened within him. We also thank you for Eco Congregation Scotland. Empower them in creating a Scotland that cares for God's creation now and forever. And we pray for all of us gathered here tonight. Come, Holy Spirit, infuse in us the dream and vision of Jesus, such that we may become disciples who are artisans of our own destiny, preparing the future. Amen. Our journey continues next week with Lorna Gold. You'll get an email out. Well, should say everyone who's here tonight and is registered for the whole of the Lenten Journey. So we'll send out the emails either on the Sunday night or Monday morning for the subsequent one on the Thursday. So that's Lorna Gold next week, Thursday the 25th. And one other thing, if we could cover, is the SLN has a petition about Bible texts at Mass must speak an inclusive language. It is not too well known that the Scottish Bishops' Conference has decided to adopt a new translation for Bible texts that are read at Mass services. And we are concerned that this translation continues to use gender-inclusive language when the equal partnership of women and men is fundamental to our society and to the credibility of the Church today. So we ask you to please join us in signing our petition, asking for Bible translation in inclusive language. Details will be sent out in the email with a recording of this Lenten session. And very briefly, a note for those who've already signed or attempted to sign the petition. There seems to have been some issues with the signing process, and we suspect that a significant number of signatures may not have been registered. Change.org have advised us that this may be due to issues of browser or device incompatibility. So if you've already signed our petition, could we ask you to send a quick email saying you have? We can then check it on our list and get back to you if you aren't included. If you could use the subject line petition, just so that there's a lot of emails coming to the network's account, and it's easier to deal with the petition ones if they're headed that way. And we would encourage you, when you get the stuff, to share the petition as widely as possible. So thanks everyone again. Thanks to Jim and to everyone that contributed, and have a good night.